You hear that sound? Da-dum, 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 da-dum. It's the sound of the true heartbeat of ISTDP, the living soul of ISTDP that you're about to get a flavor of. Because today, we're going to get into the case of the Little Blonde Dutch Girl from 1980. It's one of my all time favorites. As I just implied, I think that this case really represents Davanloo at his best, and it captures the living soul of ISTDP. So I'm obviously super stoked to be presenting it to you. The first part of my review is going to be a bit more fine-haired and granular than some of my other reviews, where I'm going to try to unearth what I see as the operating principles. But then, because I really want to give you a window and give you a flavor of what I see as the incredible beauty in all of this, Davanloo at his best, the living soul and heartbeat of ISTDP, I'm going to just read a few pages towards the end of the article. So you can just take it in and form your own opinion. And then I'll close off with a few more of my reflections. But that's what's in store. So please enjoy. All right, here we are. So, the case of the Little Blonde Dutch Girl. The case takes place in a chapter called Trial Therapy. It's chapter 7, as you can see, and it's in this book, Short Term Dynamic Psychotherapy, published in 1980. The lead up to the transcript has all kinds of fascinating ideas that Davanloo is talking about trial therapy itself, the extended initial session. But that's outside the scope of this review. We're going to just focus on the transcript, which starts here on page 102. Before diving in, though, I do want to just say something about the style that we're going to see in this transcript as it compares to Davanloo's later development, which was more of the vertical approach of systematic and unremitting pressure and challenge. And I want to be clear that I do see a lot of value in the unremitting, more vertical approach. I think it's important to learn how to work that way, and that there are definitely a set of patients that are going to be very, very helped by that approach. But that said, I think that it's true that while all patients can benefit from a less vertical style, not all patients respond well to unrelenting pressure and challenge. I also think that one of the risks of emphasizing a more vertical approach is that the fundamentals of developing a strong conscious therapeutic alliance and the relationship building side of things, that can be overlooked. I remember Marvin Scorman, my teacher for over a decade. I remember him saying that he would often observe Davanloo engaging in heavy pressure and challenge, but on a good day anyway, it was clear that the emotional connection and sense of alliance and partnership with the patient was not sacrificed at all. In fact, it was palpable, and it was actually enhanced rather than diminished with the approach, the heavy pressure and challenge in this case. And so I think that that speaks to the ideal, which is that whether we're doing a more or less vertical approach, the idea is that the emotional connection with the patient is intensified and enhanced. All right, so enough of that. Let's get into the case. All right, so here we are, page 102, and here Davanloo goes into some of the patient's chief complaints and a little bit about her. She's a 22-year-old student. She complains of depression, crying spells, a constant fear of rejection by other people, a pattern in relation to men characterized by passivity and a need to bend over backwards to please them, and problems with her parents. I really, really like this opening right here. Therapist, Davanloo. I really don't know anything about you except da 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 da. Would you like to tell me what seems to be the problem? I mean, look at that. It's so down to earth, and he's openly acknowledging that he knows nothing about her. And that conveys, hey, we're starting with a blank slate. I don't really have any preconceptions about you. And then he asks whether the patient wants to share rather than assuming that she will or that she wants to. So to me, that subtly leaves room for the possibility that she may not wish to disclose anything right away. And this attitude is critical, in my opinion, when it comes to fostering a therapeutic relationship that honors her autonomy while demonstrating a genuine interest in understanding her on her terms. I can't underscore enough how important that is. So this is more than an intervention. This is really an approach that represents a way of being in relationship. It indirectly undermines compliance, defiance, while it also sets the stage for a corrective emotional experience, because chances are she's not used to being approached with that attitude. Okay, and then here we have Davanloo refers to what the patient set up here as a hopeful sign. And so I thought that was pretty cool. What's hopeful is that the patient has a certain degree of insight already into how she operates. She refers to crying as an escape. She knows that it doesn't solve anything, it just puts things off, and that it's a vicious circle. And so the fact that Davanloo is so tuned into hopeful signs, I think that's quite cool. In other words, he's not at all only focused on defenses or resistance, but he's also focusing on patient strengths. Then here, Davanloo says, would you like to tell me more about these problems that you have with people? And by framing the question in this way, he acknowledges that, again, right, she may not want to elaborate, which once again communicates respect for her autonomy. And it subtly, but crucially, signals that he's meeting her, where she's at. He is trying to address her on her terms rather than imposing an agenda and reinforcing the foundation for genuine engagement. And then here at the bottom of page 102, Davanloo has said, aha, can you be more specific? Which requests specificity rather than calling out the absence of it. So it's a more supportive gesture. And I think that the ahas, they also convey acknowledgement as in, I'm hearing you, like it's a classic active listening stance. And then here now on page 103, the first paragraph right here, let me just read it. The patient is vague, very passive, and has a tendency to ruminate. She gives details, but one cannot get a clear picture of the nature of her interpersonal problems. She says that the reason for her difficulties with her classmates and peers is that many of them smoke, drink, go dancing, and because she doesn't engage in these activities, she feels uncomfortable with them. Questioned about the feeling of discomfort, she says she feels very self-conscious. She further indicates that she feels self-conscious because she is different in terms of her activities. Further exploration reveals that she feels the same way with those peers who don't drink and smoke, etc. Then it becomes clear that this pattern is with everybody. At this point, she's unable to give a specific example and ruminates mostly on the smoking and drinking of her peers. Okay. Okay, so this paragraph, it reveals two key points. One, Davanloo is in search of what I call the shared dream experience. And we see that in his remark, quote, one cannot get a clear-cut picture of the nature of her interpersonal problems, end of quote. So he's looking for a deeper, shared understanding of the patient's struggles, what Davanloo later called a true and living picture on page 113, and we'll get to that. Another indicator that Davanloo is always trying to get a clear picture or a shared dream. It comes later when Davanloo writes, quote, each time the defenses are challenged, a little more detail emerges. It emerges with increasing clarity, page 115, and we'll get to that too. But you see how that reinforces the idea that he's always trying to facilitate this shared dream. The shared dream experience, it's extremely central in how Davanloo works. And so if you'd like to hear more about it, I have put two links to two other videos that I've made that really go into the shared dream. So that'll be in the description section. The other thing that stands out to me here is that despite Davanloo's desire for greater clarity, he remains patient. He remains engaged. He continues to listen. He's encouraging the patient to elaborate on what she's sharing. And this demonstrates that he's meeting her where she's at and he's taking great care to thoroughly try to understand her conscious frame of reference. He is not skimping on that. And I think that is absolutely critical and something that for some reason seems to have fallen out of favor in contemporary ISTDP. There tends to be like a single-minded focus on simply just decoding and accessing the unconscious. Another way to put it is that he's taking the time to get to know her. He's not rushing, he's not imposing, but allowing the therapeutic relationship to develop organically. And, I'm not sure that this is what people tend to associate with ISTDP, this way of working. And so that's part of the reason why I feel so strongly about doing this is because to me, this is Davanloo at his best. This is ISTDP. So I feel really strongly about giving people a window into this version of Davanloo. And we have this bit right here, that I just highlighted. The patient says what happens to her and what she does, but does not answer the question of what she experiences. End of quote. And then on the heels of this, it's noteworthy that Davanloo stays in silence before offering the most obvious inference in response to what she has shared, which is, quote, so you feel nervous with people. Could you tell me more about it? As soon as the patient actually shares something about what she experiences, Davanloo simply repeats this so as to anchor the understanding between them. And the operating principle here is that supporting collaboration and acts of openness and honesty while holding off on defense work in favor of gentle requests for elaboration and specificity, in other words, gentle pressure. This also amounts to a therapeutic stance that mitigates against unconscious reenactments, that is, getting in the shoes, in contrast to attempts to rapidly mobilize, which can create those problems. This last paragraph of the page, it shows that even though Davanloo has identified that the patient pulls out the rug, that she dismisses what she has begun to describe, right? That's what I mean by pulling out the rug. She pulls out the rug from what she has just said. Davanloo is still prioritizing finding out more about the circumstances that generate her anxiety in the original onset of this problem. So that goes to show again that he's not taking the bait at every sign of a defense. He's not jumping on everything. He's not obsessed with pointing out every little defense at this stage in the treatment. He's still just drawing her out. He's making a mental notation of this defensive behavior, but he doesn't feel he has to pounce on it. He's just continuing to try to draw her out and inquiring into all of these things. Onward to page 104 here. So the patient is passive and uninvolved. Says Davanloo right here. The patient is passive and uninvolved. However, again, this is along the same vein as I was just talking about, but it's remarkable that Davanloo's response to this is to continue to take an interest, to show curiosity. And in his own words, quote, gently but persistently trying to get the patient to be more specific and to describe what she actually experiences, end of quote. And then here, right here, the one I'm flashing right here, quote, then you were the passive person, end of quote. This comment by Davanloo represents his shift to more directly trying to speak to her defense of passivity because he observed that his previous approach did not yield sufficient results. And so this highlights that Davanloo was hoping to draw the patient out through curiosity and repeated requests for specificity and elaboration. And only when this fails does he pivot towards more direct defense work. I think that in and of itself is actually pretty fascinating. And then we have the patient responding here. Yeah, afraid of fighting back in case something would happen in the relationship. And so, yeah, the patient responds positively to this form of attunement from Davanloo. She responds in the form of more revealing communication and collaboration, the afraid of fighting back comment. And the tidbit about self-contradiction when she is afraid of expressing herself, that's here on page 105. So I think it's noteworthy that, it's worth repeating that these transcripts make it unmistakably clear that Davanloo operates with a resistance communication continuum in mind, where he interprets communication that reveals significant and intimate aspects of the patient as the alliance, and then ways of relating that are obfuscating, he interprets as resistance. In light of this, I hope it's clear how absolutely essential the shared dream experience is for Davanloo. It's the ultimate barometer that helps him determine whether there's progression or the absence of progression. Right? Remember the citation that I offered earlier, quote, one cannot get a clear-cut picture, end of quote. So I know I'm repeating this a lot about the shared dream. In fact, I'm saying it so much I'm sick of hearing it, but that's how important it is. All right, still on page 105 here. This paragraph, let me read it. This one right here. Right here. Here, some evaluators might try to interpret this piece of content to the patient in terms of her indirect ways of provoking her boyfriend. Since, in fact, the patient is still in a state of massive underlying resistance, which is later revealed as having clear transference implications, this would almost certainly have been a mistake, and the interpretation would have been wasted. On his guard, the evaluator merely presses her to look more closely at what she does, whereupon the underlying resistance is immediately revealed. She remobilizes her defenses and tries to dismiss the whole issue as unimportant. Okay, so I think here part of what's interesting is the timing of interpretations and the issue of the clear transference implication of her resistance. So Davanloo is obviously referring to the idea that when a patient is in a major resistance, interpretations are often wasted. This is a period of time where Davanloo sees interpretations as one of many tools that can be used to actually chip away at resistance. But he is also referring to the idea that it's important that the interpretations be well timed. So that's one key idea. But the other is this other piece where we know that the patient is employing defenses in the therapy session. But Davanloo makes this distinction between resistance that implies transference and therefore resistance that does not imply transference, right? He writes the patient is still in a state of massive underlying resistance, which is later revealed as having a clear transference implication. So this begs the question, what non-transference based resistance involves, right? And so forgive the brief theoretical excursion here, but this might be a little bit interesting. So my understanding is that non-transference based resistance refers to solidified habitual defenses and generalized avoidance that have not yet crystallized into a specific relational dynamic with the therapist. So in this state, the patient is avoiding feelings altogether, which by default results in sort of a broad, non-specific avoidance of emotional closeness, not just with the therapist, but with everyone. So that stands in contrast to transference resistance, in which the therapist has become a meaningful object representing a particular person or class of persons from the patient's past, thereby activating a specific transference dynamic. So while characterological resistance, as in generalized resistance against emotional closeness that has solidified into a chronic character armor, that lacks an immediate transference component. But nevertheless, its building blocks are nonetheless the internalized object relations from past relationships. However, these object relations have become rigid and generalized into a habitual way of being in the world rather than surfacing in the therapy room as an activated transference struggle. So, in essence, non transference resistance reflects a global avoidance of feeling and connection, whereas transference resistance marks the point where the therapist becomes woven into the patient's unconscious relational world, triggering an active engagement with past object relations in the here and now. Yeah, that was a bit of a mouthful. Okay, let's get back to the transcript. All right, so page 106, 107. We see that the patient's tendency to contradict herself, to be vague and evasive, it's beginning to intensify. And she is also demonstrating that she knows that she is being evasive. This leads to Davanloo doing what first appears to be a short-range head-on collision, but actually turns out to be a protracted one. Page 108 here. So in the protracted head-on collision, we see that Davanloo focuses on conveying genuine sympathy, his words, by using the word agony, his word, but that he's also very focused on not letting the patient off the hook, his words. So in other words, he does not want to reduce pressure, but he wants to keep the patient's feet to the fire so that she can begin to really turn against her resistance. When Davanloo questions the patient about whether or not she came here of her own volition, he makes it clear that in the commentary that he's open to the possibility that the patient has arrived under duress, and he actually really wants to check that out. Davanloo is realistic about this sometimes being the case, rather than assuming that everyone who shows up for therapy are actually ready to do the work. But, the bit about conveying sympathy while still keeping her feet to the fire deserves attention. The premise of this line of thinking is that The avoidant or the resistant part of the patient would like to tune out the idea of personal responsibility. Tuning out that side of things helps the patient perpetuate the avoidance. So the combination of sympathy and accountability is therefore a powerful combo. As long as the sympathy isn't in the service of coddling or pampering the patient. So no mental pedicures on the menu. And then down here, what I'm flashing here, Davanloo is saying, why do you do that? Is this the way that you are in every relationship? Is this your way with other people? Okay. And then long pause, long pause. His question, why do you do that? It's important to consider this. This intervention of why do you do that, or why do you want to defeat this process? This way of working or these kinds of interventions, I don't think they're getting a lot of attention. And yet, these interventions were integral to Davanloo's mobilization work. It's important to understand that just like the challenge to the UTA, what are you going to do about it? That these type of questions are also rhetorical. He's not inviting the patient to intellectualize or to psychoanalyze herself. Instead, they're used to cast doubt on the resistance. They are subtle forms of talking down to the superego, which is another important way of working that was really central to Davanloo's approach, actually. And that also doesn't seem to get a lot of attention. So the hoped for response to these kind of questions is an emphatic, "Oh, I don't want to do this to myself. I can't believe I'm sabotaging myself in this way." This is all in the service of trying to turn the patient against the resistance, to make the resistance ego dystonic. If it's not done well, it can, of course, be taken as an attack, as a shaming comment. And that is something to be avoided, of course. And the long pauses you see highlighted here in green, the fact that Davanloo allows for long pauses seems to suggest that he is giving space for the interventions to really sink in. And then, as you can see here, Davanloo comments that he believes that confrontational interventions, the ones that he just engaged, that they have aroused feelings in the patient. And then the idea of the timing of asking about feelings, okay? Notice that it is when Davanloo believes that feelings are near the surface that he decides to ask about feelings. See, this keeps the work experiential. And here, therapist, how do you feel right now? He's asking about feelings, just like I said, because here, the therapist knows that this silence is concerned with feelings aroused by his repeated confrontations, which must be brought out at once, particularly as they are likely to include angry feelings. Okay, so right, that's the backdrop. So therefore, he's asking, "How do you feel right now?" He's not just willy-nilly asking for feelings or asking for feelings for the sake of asking for feelings. No, no, no. He's asking about feelings because he senses that they are near the surface. Then the patient says, "As though I have been scolded." And then the therapist, "In a way, you didn't like what I said." Patient, "Oops, that is how I feel." That therapist, "What do you feel inside?" Patient, "Kind of shaky." So let's think about how Davanloo chooses to deal with this, right? He makes this comment about, so in a way, you did not like what I said. I think that is a two-pronged intervention. One, it subtly questions the perception of being scolded by offering the idea that it may have more to do with that she just didn't like it, right? What he said, as opposed to him actually scolding her. And then, secondly, it anchors the idea of anger as the experience of not liking, right? That is what anger boils down to. All anger can be distilled down to the sense of not liking. So it's actually a quite elegant and lovely way of redefining anger and detoxifying anger for people that associate anger with what we would consider to be the combination of anxiety and defense. You know, temper tantrums, being hurtful, lashing out, snarky, sarcastic, you name it, right? So redefining anger can be ever so essential. Okay, and then we have page 109. So here, Davanloo, he discontinues the inquiry into feelings in the T. Okay, he discontinues that inquiry in favor of giving space for the patient to feel the pain of acknowledging her self-defeating pattern and her wall. This goes to show that helping patients become acquainted with their defenses and turning them against their defenses, it takes priority over pushing for an emotional breakthrough. Emotional breakthroughs are most healing and most powerful when the patient has been thoroughly acquainted with their defenses. In fact, a prominent reason for applying pressure to begin with is to smoke out the defenses so that the patient can become familiar with them. All right, moving right along. Page 110. So here, Davanloo, let's see. Yeah, right here. This bit right here that I just highlighted. Let me see. Therapist. There's a need in you for you to be pushed around because that takes care of the problems. Somebody solves it for you, whether for your best interest or not. And there's a conflict in you, a need for you to stand on your own 2 feet. Patient, yeah, a kind of vacillation between the two, back and forth. But I think I am much more pushed around. Okay. So Davanloo here is honing in on a central conflict within the patient, right? Which is that on the one hand, she has a need to be pushed around because that takes care of the problem. Somebody solves it for you, whether it's in your best interest or not, right? And then he says there's a conflict in you, a need for you to stand on your own 2 feet. And then, right, she says what we just said here. Yeah, that it vacillates between the two, but she is pushed around much more. So this shows really good insight on the part of the patient, and it highlights the importance of the therapist identifying the patient's core conflicts. You know, as you look at this transcript, you'll see that Davanloo uses the word, and the evaluator senses this or that. And he also refers to the word living. And I want to say a couple of things about these references to sensing and living. Davanloo seems to repeatedly highlight the therapist's intuitive engagement with the patient's material. So, for instance, he writes, quote, the evaluator now senses that at last he can pursue da 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 da, end of quote. Or, quote, the therapist focuses on an area he senses may well be crucial, okay, page 114. Or the evaluator senses that it will be meaningful to make an interpretation, page 115. Or he also senses that she can take further painful revelations, page 120. On page 114, Davanloo describes shifting the subject without an immediate empirical link. And he refers to this as his own creative free association. And then he follows up with, quote, the therapist can use creative free association as well as the patient, end of quote. And then on page 123, he refers to the patient offering a living detail. And on page 113, he describes a true living picture of her disastrous relationships with men. He never explicitly defines what he means by the word living, but we can infer that it stands in opposition to the word dead, which I would assume, imply material that is detached, defended, and divorced from spontaneity, aliveness, and the actual truth of the patient's life. So I'm taking this little detour because I think all of this underscores Davanloo's reliance on counter-transferential felt sense, intuition, and creativity in his work. And I think it serves as a reminder that while systematized approaches to ISTDP are invaluable, they must not marginalize or devalue intuition. Certainly, we don't want to fly by the seat of our pants or play tennis without a net, but we must also guard against becoming so rigid and rule bound that we lose access to creativity, intuition, our felt sense, and um, and the living quality that Davanloo is emphasizing. On it's not this book, it's the yellow one, published in 1990 and 95, Unlocking the Unconscious. On page 3 of that book, Davanloo openly acknowledges that he largely developed ISTDP through his intuition. And then in later writings, he became adamant about its scientific foundation and he distanced himself from intuition. But, I'm thinking likely more as a strategic move to secure credibility within the scientific community more than as a genuine rejection of the role of intuition. Um, I remain fully aligned with vintage Davanloo, the guy who frequently speaks of what he is sensing, who describes pictures and details as living, and who openly endorses therapist creativity. It's in these early transcripts that I find the living soul of ISTDP. Yes, there is a roadmap, a system, but it's in the background, not the foreground. It provides structure without constraining the process, allowing for something alive, something fluid and relational to emerge. The living soul of ISTDP. It's not confined to algorithms or codified manuals. It moves through the space the system leaves open. So I'm getting carried away. So let's press forward. Let's look at page 111 here. So this piece right here, Davanloo is writing, but there are times when she gets angry and the picture gets worse. During the next passage, the therapist employs a standard technique, which is to force the patient to focus on exactly what happens and exactly what she feels in these situations. Cards up. I mean, I don't like how Davanloo describes the standard technique as forcing the patient. I think it would be more accurate to say strongly encourage or prompt. It's probably due to the fact that English was not Davanloo's native tongue. He was from Iran, so I looked into the words and phrases in Farsi that might be translated into the English word force, but without the coercive connotation. And I'll probably butcher the pronunciation, but targib kardan is actually Farsi for strongly encourage. There's also the phrase tashvig kardan, which means to encourage or to motivate. So my guess is that Davanloo meant to use the word force in step with these Farsi phrases, and that he did not mean to imply coercion. I mean, you saw the beginning of the transcript. Everything was organized around respecting the patient's autonomy. I mean, those eager to trash Davanloo and to characterize him as victimizing his patients, they're going to pounce on the use of this word force here, and I think that's unfortunate. ISTDP can be forceful, but it should never be coercive. And the emphasis, in my opinion, is really on that it can be forceful, but it can also be applied without any forcefulness whatsoever, really. All right, so we're at page 115 here. On this page, what I find interesting is that Davanloo is describing his approach here with his patient at this juncture as using a didactic as well as interpretive technique. And obviously, the method is still rooted in a very strong experiential focus. But I think this goes to show that there can be room for interpretations and an education forward element within ISTDP, as long as it is still very much rooted and grounded in an experiential focus. Then let's get to page 121. Okay, here, right here. It's highlighted in green. I'm flashing it like this. Okay, quote, the therapist now knows that therapeutically speaking, it will be crucial to reach her feelings about the loss of the close relation with her father, if possible through living recollected detail. I think he meant to write reliving. But he's not yet ready to attempt this. So here he's talking about himself in third person for some reason, he being Davanloo. So Davanloo is not yet ready to attempt this. He, Davanloo, still wants to fill in detail about relations within the family, and therefore asks first about the relation that her parents had to one another, and then about the relation between the patient and her mother. Okay. And then on page 122, right here, this bit, okay, quote, then the session moves toward the early part of the patient's life, the fact that she was her father's favorite, and her wish that she could have a closer relationship with her mother. She talks resentfully about her father's frequent business trips. And whenever her father was away, she used to stay out of the house a lot, riding her bike, which was then her favorite pastime. Now, at last, it is time to focus on the point at which her relationship with her father deteriorated. End of quote. So, I mean, two things. Just notice the level of detail in which Davanloo is getting to know the patient. I mean, this has been a central focus throughout the transcript and throughout my commentary, that he is drawing her out. He is really getting to know her, right? The main focus is not getting a major rise in complex transference feelings. It's not getting dramatic unlockings of the unconscious, what I've called the pressure cooker exploding with affect, right? He's not aiming for that here. No, the focus is on sufficiently clearing away resistance so that he can get to know the patient in a meaningful way. So here, Davanloo is obsessed with truly getting to know the patient, which I think means that the essence of the model is working out a relationship, getting a really high rise of complex transference feelings, facilitating dramatic unlockings that can be a prerequisite for working out a relationship, but I don't think in all cases. The second thing to really make note of here, Davanloo writes on the earlier page that we just looked at that he is, quote, not yet ready to attempt this, end of quote, meaning focus on the patient's feelings about the loss of the father. Okay. But he's not saying why this is. He's not, as far as I can find anyway. I've been poring over this. So the reader is left to guess. Is it just a felt sense he has, or is there a more thought out rationale behind not being ready? When Davenant writes, quote, now at last it is time to focus on the point at which her relationship with her father deteriorated, end of quote, it's again unclear what criteria Davenant is using to determine that the timing is now right. In the interim, Davenant got more historical information regarding the patient's family, but it's not clear why this was necessary before focusing on the loss of the father. Um, I'm guessing that this really just came down to his intuition and his counter-transferential felt sense, but I don't know. All right, at this point, I would like to read 2 or 3 pages of the transcript. I think that just taking it in and getting a real sense for the dialogue at this point, hearing some of Davanloo's commentary, it's going to impart more of a flavor as opposed to looking at little chunks and piecemeal that I hone in on. So I'm hoping you're going to get a real sense for how Davanloo worked if you haven't already. Again, what I consider to be the living ISTDP, the heart and soul of his actual way of working. So, yeah, I mean, you have to start somewhere. Why not just pick? I'll just pick this page 117 down at the bottom. Therapist, even if it wasn't her fault, you lost a lot of things. You lost your front seat, lost the attention, and everybody admired this angelic child. Then let's look at your feelings. Okay, this is in reference to the patient's younger sister who was born and who was more popular than the patient. Okay, patient. I remember when she was in kindergarten, we used to share a room. I remember on Saturday mornings, we always used to play house or play dolls, generally dolls or something like that. One Saturday morning, we played dead. I played, then I said, you are going to be dead. So anyway, she laid down. I made her lay down on the bed, and I remember covering her up, right up. She eventually started crying. She didn't like it. She was scared. She fought me then. I remember just looking at her out of curiosity, and then I started crying because I felt very bad. Okay. Therapist. Wasn't it because there was a part of you that wanted her to be dead? And that was what the game was all about? And isn't that what happened in reality? Okay, so the sister ended up dying in a car accident. Okay, so I promised that I wouldn't offer much commentary, but it's hard to resist. I just want to point out, and I'm going to try to not actually offer commentary, but I just want to point out that Davenloo had said, so then let's look at your feelings. And the patient responds in this manner. And sure, of course, sometimes the right thing to do is to say, well, that doesn't say how you feel. Okay. We're getting, historical narrative here, but what are your feelings? But notice that at this juncture, Davenloo is not a stickler for that. He recognizes that what the patient shared was from the heart, it was from the UTA. It was massively significant. Okay. So it can be a mistake to be overly rigid about, I just asked about feelings. That doesn't say how you feel. You didn't answer the question. I mean, for sure, sometimes you want to do that, but it's a mistake to be too rigid about it. Okay. Sorry about that. It's hard to resist. Back to the transcript here. Let's see. Patient. I don't know. I guess I thought about what it would be like if she were dead, if she wasn't around. and she died. But gee, my negative feelings, if there are any, are very deep because I don't really feel them. I have probably hidden them if they are there. Therapist, and we're right here, by the way. You see, you repeatedly say guess and probably, and you don't want to face your real feelings. And that is the reason you pay such a heavy price by being insecure, by being constantly afraid of being rejected, and not standing on your own 2 feet and trying to play the role of a nice girl in order to be liked by people, giving up your own self rather than being a free human being, to be as you really are in your own right. Patient down here now. Here. Um, After she died, I tried really hard to be like her. I remember some friends of my parents at the funeral saying that it was too bad that it was Becky who had died. In other words, a lot of people around the patient actually had preferred if the patient died instead of her sister. So you can imagine that that would be painful. Okay, therapist. Then it seems that many people said the same thing. Patient, I was obnoxious when I was young, laughing. Therapist, let's look at this being obnoxious. What does that mean? Would you think that that was the manifestation of the fact that you were not happy, that you were upset? Now, what were you upset about? Was it that you were pushed off your pedestal? Patient, yeah, and I'm right here. Okay. Yeah, before my sister was born, I had all the attention for 3 years. I was also a novelty, a new baby, the whole bit. And I had total attention for 3 years. And then it was totally robbed from me for a long time. And the only way I knew I could get attention from my parents was to be bad, to do something bad. And then they would notice me then. And I knew in school it was the same way. I wanted the attention of the teacher. I couldn't be a non-entity in the class. I wanted to be known. I used to do naughty things. In grade 2, I beat up the teacher once, and in grade 3, I ran away from school, and I clawed a teacher like this, right down her face. Therapist, a woman, patient, down here at the very bottom. Yes, I hated her. Therapist, we're up here now. Okay, therapist. Were you particularly angry at your mother? Patient, I don't know, but I have a lot of problems with women. And now, commentary. Then the patient discusses her difficulties with women, that she has always had a lot of problems with them. Then the session focuses on the day of the funeral. Her mother was in intensive care in the hospital. Patient. Anyway, when they lowered the casket, I felt then really a surge of crying. I ran to my neighbor, a woman who I really don't know very well to this day, but someone I respect, you know. She was at the back. She was nice to me, so I ran to her. I ran around the casket right to her. Therapist. Let's look at the lowering of the casket. What it meant to you. Patient. Well, that was it. It was just that I knew I would never see her again. Therapist. Being covered up. And isn't that the game you had played? In the game, you covered her up with some sheets. And here was the same thing. Patient. Yeah, but this was more final than the other. And now here Davanloo's commentary. This chunk right here, okay. Then the therapist questions the patient about what the neighbor had done. The patient says she comforted her, but she didn't stay long in her arms as she felt embarrassed because all her family was there. Why hadn't she gone to them? The therapist indicates that she didn't go to them because she felt all of them preferred her sister. The patient said she was afraid of being rejected by the members of her family, and the therapist questioned why they would reject her. Therapist. What were they going to reject you about? What was so bad about you that people would reject you if they knew it? Patient. I don't know. Crying. Therapist. You don't want to look at it. Let's see. What is the worst thing we can think of for which people could reject you if they knew. We know about the dead game. Patient. Maybe they felt that I killed her. Therapist. And that you were glad about it, too. Patient. I do remember thinking, now I will have my own room. Laughing. Therapist. You were afraid that they may have perceived that, and if they had known, that they would have felt you were terrible. And that is why you ran to the lady who didn't know you? Patient. I guess I wanted to go to someone who didn't really know me. Therapist. And that was the way you keep your secret. Let's look at your secret. Patient. That I might have been happy that she was dead. Therapist. You say might. Were you happy or weren't you happy? Patient. Yes, the patient is crying and distraught. Therapist. But of course, this doesn't mean you didn't also love her. And obviously, you had some good things together. But what we have learned today is that your sister had certain advantages that you did not have. You were displaced from the front seat. You lost your pedestal. People preferred her for one reason or another. You had all the attention for the first 3 years and lost all that. And then you had to get attention by being bad. So clearly you had a lot of feelings, and these feelings have been buried, but they are coming to the surface in this interesting little game you played about her dying. Patient. It's very strange. Therapist. When this game became a reality, it became intolerable. And what you did with all these feelings was to bury them. Patient. Yeah. Therapist. But don't you think it's time that came out for you to face them for what they are? Because they are honest and they are straightforward. Commentary. It's clear that though she was first very upset by this piece of therapeutic work, she's now experiencing relief. The therapist intuitively knows that this is by no means the end of the story, and encouraged by her response so far, he also senses that she can take further painful revelations. He therefore begins exploring an area which hitherto has been conspicuous by its absence, namely the relation with her father. Because of previous work on her resistances, the information she has given is highly meaningful and full of feeling. But resistance is by no means over, and it returns as soon as the therapist touches on the possibility of resentment against her father. Therapist, we're up here now. How would you describe your relationship with your father? Patient. Then I remember I was daddy's little girl. He used to take me with him, particularly on Saturdays, to his office. I used to go with him then. I used to wrestle with him. And he often used to call me his little Dutch girl. Then I was very blonde. Commentary. The session focuses further on her relationship with her father, which indicates that she had a close relationship with her father, and he used to give her a lot of attention. She said he used to put her on his knee or his foot and bounce her up and down, and he used to put her on his hand and hold her up in the air. He used to take her with him to lunch with a business colleague. Other memories are related to her dressing up like a tomboy and helping her father do things like wash the car. Her relationship with her father changed completely after the car accident, where her sister and I believe her mother also died. She found him unapproachable. Oh no, the mother didn't die, she was just badly injured. She found him unapproachable. He was preoccupied with her mother's hospitalization and the household activities, etc. Therapist. In a sense, then, you also lost your father after the accident. Patient. Yeah, I lost my father then. But I did gain a mother. My mother didn't have a sister anymore, but she needed someone. I babysat my mother, if you want to put it that way, for 4 or 5 years. Okay, commentary. Then the session focuses on the present. The patient said her relationship with her father specifically deteriorated. She said that at present it is horrible and that he has threatened to kick her out of the house. She is very uncomfortable with him and hardly talks with him. She said that it seemed that after the automobile accident, her whole life changed completely. Quote, it was like a dividing point, end of quote. Further exploration indicates that she was closest to her oldest sister and did not have much of a relationship with her other sister or her brother. The therapist now knows that therapeutically speaking, it will be crucial to reach her underlying feelings about the loss of the close relationship with her father, if possible through reliving recollected detail, but he's not yet ready to attempt this. He still wants to fill in detail about relations within the family and therefore asks first about the relation that her parents had to one another and then about the relation between the patient and her mother. All right, I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit to, yeah, we're at 125. We were at 121. So I'm skipping ahead a little bit. So let's dive in right here. Therapist, from what you have told me, in your relationship with your boyfriend, you take a very passive position. There's a constant fear that he might leave you, and at the same time, there's a buildup of anger and hostility. From what you have told me, you deal with it in one of two ways. Either you start to scratch the door, hyperventilate, and bang your head against the wall. The other is to become extremely passive and take the position of a beaten, passive woman. Commentary. The patient now admits both the source of the passivity and the intensity of the anger underneath. Patient. Yeah. When I can no longer deal with the situation, I become very passive, and at the same time, I am boiling inside. Therapist. Then my question is this. Is passivity not a way of dealing with hostility? And if this is not an operation with me, patient. I don't know you as a person. This is your profession. If I knew you as a person, you would probably get the same treatment. Commentary. The evaluator brushes aside this attempt to evade the issue while giving the impression that she is considering it. Page 126. Therapist. But let's look at this nearly 2 hour interview. Don't you think that you've been constantly putting up an iron wall around yourself and hiding behind it? And I have on many occasions had to dig and dig. I'm sure that during this interview we've been able to break through some of these barriers and we've touched on some very important issues. But it has at the same time been only with a great amount of digging. You're always hiding behind something. Is this passive way you take here with me? Is this an expression of some hostility in relation to me? Patient. I know, I know, I know. Okay, okay, I can tell you. Now the patient is crying. I put up these defenses, like with my boyfriend. And I noticed that I put up a barrier and I don't let another person get to know me. I do it a lot. Perhaps you're right that I resent opening up completely. Therapist. Do you think that at one level it might have its roots in your relationship with your father, with whom you had a very close, intimate relationship, but then he changed completely? Patient. Uh-huh. Therapist. At one time you left yourself open and you were your father's little Dutch girl, little yellow bird. And suddenly he dropped you. Now you don't allow yourself to be open. And we have seen this all through the interview with me. Patient. All people. Therapist. Of course, but I am specifically focusing on your relationship here with me and your need to put up an iron wall and not let yourself be open. Patient. Yeah. Therapist. Do you think then that there's a connection between this and your father? Patient. Yeah, I do. Therapist. Huh? Patient. I do. I can tell you exactly when it happened and what I said to myself. I am never again going to get close to anybody. It was just after the automobile accident, and Becky was dead by then. My father and my sister used to stay at the hospital until late every night, and I was going to school. And I used to have to go to a friend's place after school. There were a few boys and girls, and I never felt comfortable there. And I worked. I used to do all the dishes and help to do the cooking, do everything I could to earn my keep, or whatever it was there. And then I used to come home, and at first, for about 2 weeks after Becky died, I slept in the same bed with my father, where my mother used to sleep. Okay, Oedipal. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be doing commentary here. And one night I was in bed, and this was actually on a Saturday. I think it was. And Dad came upstairs and said, "Go to your own bed now." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Just go to your own bed." So I got up and left the room and went to my own bed, and I remember crying. And it was never the same after that. Therapist, let's look at this. Becky is gone forever. Your mother is in the hospital and not home anymore. And then you were faced with the loss of your father. You are no longer his little yellow bird. You want to take your mother's place in the bed, but you're no longer his favorite. Let's look at your feelings then. Patient. Well, he thought it was about time I started to stand on my own 2 feet. Therapist. Was there something else? You had a very special relationship with your father, and now you wanted to see it in a very exclusive way. But he told you, out. What are your ideas about this? Your father didn't want you to take your mother's place in the bed. Patient. I don't have any idea about this. He didn't want me around anymore. Therapist. Let's focus at this moment on the issue of not wanting you around anymore. Having a very special relationship with your father and suddenly being dropped like that. Then isn't there at some level the element of hostility and resentment? And as you put it so well, I'm never again going to get close to anybody. And as we can see, this has been true in the past 2 hours with me. And do you think that this might become a problem in therapy? Because obviously, for as long as you have to hide behind a wall and take a passive position, we cannot get to the core of your problem, and you'll perpetuate your suffering. But I am glad that we were able to break through and touch on some of the very important issues that are the central core of your problem. So that concludes the transcript. There is some additional commentary here by Davanloo, but that's the end of the transcript. Everyone's going to form their own opinion about this, but to me, this reads as an emotionally intimate dialogue between two people. There is a natural fluidity, there's an organic rhythm to the exchange. Nothing is really formulaic or mechanical about it. Davanloo introduces various interventions, but I think they're seamlessly woven into the fabric of the conversation, and they're always in service of drawing the patient out, sharpening the focus, and facilitating deeper experiential understanding. What stands out is how deeply immersed Davanloo is in the details of what the patient shares. He listens with an attuned presence. He's continuously referencing the patient's words, threading them back into the evolving focus of the session. And yet, he's not merely reflecting, he actively engages. He boldly inserts himself at key moments with interventions like, well, let's look into this idea, or what you did with all these feelings was to bury them, or that is one aspect, but there is more to it. These are not arbitrary techniques being deployed from a manual. They arise from a place of deep connection and responsiveness to the patient's inner world. There is an unmistakable conversational quality to the interaction. One never gets the sense that Davanloo is simply applying techniques to the patient. Instead, what emerges is a dynamic, real relationship unfolding in the moment. A relational dance where he moves fluidly between gently directing and giving the patient space to express herself freely. At times, his stance is exploratory, inviting the patient to reflect more deeply. At other times, he presses forward with greater urgency, challenging defenses, or expanding the frame of focus. But throughout, there is an undeniable sense of human engagement, not a rigid application of protocol. Instead, it's a living, breathing therapeutic process. The power of these moments lies in their relational immediacy. Davanloo does not position himself as an external observer analyzing the patient from a clinical distance. He's in it with her, responding in real time, co-creating the unfolding narrative of the session. The system of ISTDP, it is present, but it is in the background, not the foreground. It's a structure that supports but does not constrain. What takes center stage is the aliveness of the encounter, the raw and unfiltered process of truth seeking that unfolds between therapist and patient. This is what makes the interaction so compelling. It's not just one person applying a method to another person, it's an encounter between two minds in the pursuit of something real. In the interest of time, I need to wrap this up now, but I hope I gave you something meaningful to think about. And more than anything, I hope I was able to convey not just some of the key principles of ISTDP, but also its spirit. The Davanloo I so deeply love and admire. The Davanloo who moves beyond technique into something profoundly human, something raw, intimate, and alive. At its best, this work is not just about procedures, not just about pressure, challenge, unlocking the unconscious. It's about meeting another person in the trenches of their suffering, following the unconscious therapeutic alliance, and humbly guiding them toward facing the truths that they have long avoided, boldly, relentlessly, but always with care and humility. That's the ISTDP that moves me, that animates my work. I hope some of that came through in what I've shared.